This week on Waterways, alligators of South Florida, and Park Service plant and animal inventories. The American alligator. The largest predator left in the eastern United States. For thousands of years, it has roamed creeks, marshes, and swamps from North Carolina to Texas. In South Florida, canals and ponds that line the roads seem to be filled with alligators. While the alligators we see along the road are in good shape, those that live in remote places in the Everglades National Park are not doing so well. Scientists are studying these Everglades alligators. Looking through the alligator's eyes may tell us what went wrong with the Everglades and how we can fix it. Over the past 100 years, the fortunes of the alligator have risen and fallen again. The first major threats to alligators were the guns and axes of market hunters. The alligator's underbelly makes excellent leather. For early settlers trying to wrest a living from South Florida's marshes, the trade in alligator hides was a windfall.
Much like there was with the fur trade, there was an alligator trade. And so the hides of the alligators, and not only the hides, but the meat also, but the hides were of value. And so to people that were living out in rural areas, it would have been no different than trapping an otter. You know, alligator trades, the Native Americans, the Burdines and Stranahans and Brickell and people like that ran these trading posts. Well, you have a trading post and you're dealing in hides, whether they're alligator hides or whether they're furs. It really didn't make much difference. They were money, and that kept people alive. And there was an incredible, trade in hides. There was, it was sought all over the world. I mean, it was, kind of the vogue thing to do. Alligator purse, alligator shoes, alligator belts, but not only alligators, but any of the crocodilians. So there was really a big market for it.
Hunting was legal for most of the 20th century. The market for alligator skins took its toll. In the 1920s, hunters could find and harvest dozens of alligators during a trip. By the 1940s, they were harder to find.
Numbers declined. There was you went from an animal that was incredibly abundant to people getting very concerned that you're not seeing very many of them. So the animal, the late 60s come around, the Endangered Species Act comes into play, and the alligator goes on the list.
Making alligator hunting illegal drove up the price of hides. In the 1960s, poachers could make $400 or $500 for a few nights' work. For this kind of money, many were willing to risk arrest and fines. Between 1965 and 1971, poachers harvested at least 141,000 hides. A solution to illegal hunting arrived in 1969. The Lacey Act, passed in that year, made interstate traffic and mere possession of hides illegal. Gator poachers in Florida could no longer find traders in Georgia or other states willing to risk buying hides. The illegal trade in hides quickly dried up. While the Lacey Act protected alligators from poaching, it could not save Everglades alligators from a more serious threat: the diking, draining, and engineering of the Everglades. For thousands of years in South Florida, the marshes have swelled with summer rain and dried out under the winter sun. During the wet summer, fish breed and multiply in the marsh. During the dry winter, life congregates in deep holes dug by the alligators themselves. Fish go to these gator holes to survive the drying of the marsh. Herons, spoonbills, and storks come to stalk the fish, and the alligator comes to stalk them all. An alligator's life is linked to the seasonal flooding and drying of the marshes. Everything they do, breeding, nesting, digging gator holes, and feeding, is governed by the seasonal rise and fall of the marshes. In the Everglades of today, the seasons do not control the rhythm of water. Canals, pumps, and schedules determine how much water the marshes get and when they get it. As a result, the alligator often gets too much or too little water. As early as the 1940s, scientists guessed that the draining of the Everglades was hurting the alligator. By the 1980s, they were certain, and they felt they knew exactly where the biggest problem was: at the alligator's nest.
When they start doing their nest building in early summer, when those females place those nests, they're cued upon what the water conditions are, and it's almost like they're guessing on what the water conditions are going to be. So that's where they place it. If you get an unusual event, say a lot of rain or a management decision that puts more water into an area than would have been there naturally, then that can flood the nests out. And if it floods the nests out, then obviously you lose the production for that year.
The engineering of water flow in the Everglades has been ill news for alligator nests. The alligators can no longer accurately anticipate how the water will rise and fall with seasonal rains. Compared to other places that the alligator lives, nests in the Everglades are 5 times more likely to fail.
We do aerial surveys, and of course probably the first thing you're going to ask is, well, how do you do this from the air? Well, the thing is, we're not looking for the alligators. We're looking for the nest. That's what we're looking for, because what we're really concerned about is how much reproduction's taking place in there, and we think if we can look at that reproduction, that can give us a good handle on maybe the health of this and the productivity of this, of the environment, really. So we use helicopters. We do set transects widths, and we fly around and locate along these transects, and we locate the nests. Again, this is a little bit of an art. I mean, you learn where alligators put their nests, and they normally put them, you know, on the heads of sawgrass strands or on little tree islands and things like that. And so by doing that, you can find them. And the nests are made of vegetation. They're mounds. They're vegetation mounds. And so these things are very distinct. I mean, you can see them from the air. They're really easy to find.
Once the team locates the nests, they later return and do nest checks. The checks include water depth measurements and counting the number of eggs in each clutch. The state and federal governments are trying to recreate the natural flooding and drying of the Everglades marshes. Over the next 30 years, managers will be trying to make the marshes act more like they did 100 years ago. Sonny and his research team hope to be able to tell them when they have succeeded.
This work serves a lot of purposes. One, we can get some idea, as I said, what production is for alligators in a given year. But when you tie that to management decisions that are being made, in particular water management decisions that are being made to the north, and especially as it results in ongoing things like Everglades restoration, we can develop what we're calling now performance measures. So we can see as the restoration proceeds, we can see if we're headed in the right direction.
Sonny believes that what is best for the alligator will be best for the Everglades, and what is good for the Everglades is good for South Florida. If South Florida's fish, wading birds, and alligators are healthy, it is almost certain that our lands and waters will be healthy too.
The Everglades is not an island, it's connected to everything around us. And that's what's so important about it. You know, if the system collapses, that means the areas that we live in are threatened. And I think everybody's concerned, would be concerned about that.
Is the age of exploration over? Are there new plant and animal species waiting to be discovered? The truth is, we don't know about all the species of plants and animals that share our planet. Of the many animals and plants we know, we often know little about how many live in one place, where they move from day to day, or from season to season. The managers of our national parks are working to close the gap in our knowledge of the fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and plants that inhabit our national parks. In 1999, Congress funded a program called the Inventory and Monitoring Program. The program gave the Park Service the money they needed to hire scientists to find and study undiscovered species within the national parks. Matt Patterson coordinates the Inventory and Monitoring Program at U.S. national parks in South Florida and the Caribbean. The parks under his care include Everglades, Dry Tortugas, and Biscayne National Parks, Big Cypress National Preserve, Virgin Islands National Park, and Buck Island Reef National Monument in St. Croix.
The inventories are trying to address two main questions, the first of which is to provide a 90% level of knowledge for the vertebrates and vascular plants in each of the 6 parks in the network. The second is then to take it beyond knowing what species occur and showing their abundance and distribution. And so for many of the projects, because we're sampling in many sites, we can show the range of those species within the park and whether they're quantified by 1, 2, 3 or 1, 10, 100, 1,000. We're having a good way of then identifying frequency of occurrence and the whole population across the park or across the network.
Most people may be surprised to know that even close to a large city like Miami, there are discoveries to be made.
I guess the most exciting thing to me from the inventories thus far has been the amount of plant species that we've increased at Big Cypress and Biscayne. Biscayne has received about a 30% increase to their species list. Big Cypress is nearing a 20% increase to their species list.
One of the most exciting finds was a population of Florida's rarest cactus, the semaphore prickly pear. In 2002, managers thought there were only a few plants left, all in the lower Keys. In 2002, scientists funded by the Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program found another population containing hundreds of plants.
The find of the Apuntia coralicola, or the semaphore prickly pear cactus here at Biscayne, extended a plant population of cactus that prior to that find had only been 7 plants left in the wild in the world in the lower Keys. The find in Biscayne was over 650 individual plants, and from that find, further funding has done genetic work to see if there's ways to cross-pollinate the 2 wild populations to see if we can come up with more genetic diversity. And also it provides us a conservation plan, so if one of the 2 remnant populations gets hit by a hurricane, we have a source to bring those plants back. So by finding these additional 650, we now know that if the last 7 disappear in the lower Keys, we haven't lost an entire wild population of a certain species. Cures to cancer or other diseases may be found in the enzymes of some of these plants that protect them from pests. And so we really have to make sure that when we have rare things, we have to take care of them and keep an eye on them.
So what's the big deal? So a few species of plants have been found. Why should regular people, the non-scientific folks, care? For one, more than 1/3 of all prescription medicines in use today are based on chemicals found in plants. Medicine for childhood leukemia is based on the rosy periwinkle. Who knows what treatment for cancer or other maladies lie undiscovered in the plant kingdom? If we lose these plants, we lose that medicine. While much of Matt Patterson and his team's findings were adding to the list of species, some of their work was revealing the absence of certain species. 2 species that were quite common have not shown up on their surveys: Key Largo wood rat and the Key Largo cottonmouse. But who would miss these rodents?
Part of the value that national parks play is we try to, as much as possible, protect an entire ecosystem. Because part of what's impossible to know is the complex interrelationship of all these species to each other. We don't know what bug species, insect species may be dependent on that wood rat, that then that insect species is important for pollinating some other rare and endangered species, and that may be the only insect that does that kind of pollination. We don't understand the natural world well enough in order to be able to say, I can just get rid of that Key Largo wood rat and that's not going to have an effect. So what we try to do is to protect those things that are native and natural here and try to minimize the impacts of the exotic stuff coming into the area. So it becomes an island that scientists, researchers can use to come to national parks in order to try to unravel those very complex linkages and webs between all those species.
One of the reasons many species lie undiscovered in the South Florida parks is because the parks are so large. It is difficult to look in every alligator pond or under every coral head.
It does blow your mind when you think about trying to figure out what lives in nearly 2.5 million acres and trying to get a handle on how to spread out your sample points so that you cover the various habitats, whether they're cypress domes or pinelands or coral reefs or tropical hardwood hammocks or dry tropical forests such as the Virgin Islands. It takes a lot of specialized expertise, and we've been very fortunate to have good partners with nonprofits, with universities, and with private contractors that are top of their field, and they go out and they get into the middle of this stuff and they find the real rare stuff, which is really exciting, as well as spatially being able to describe how plant species and communities are spread out, or animal communities. It's really adding a level of knowledge to the park that the managers haven't had in the past.
Another challenge facing managers is the fact that animals don't often live their whole lives, or even a whole year, in one place. They move about, often ignoring the lines we draw on paper.
Well, part of the big challenge with a park like Biscayne National Park, we have 270 square miles. 95% of that is water. We're terrible at being able to really count and codify water things. And especially because the life cycles of a lot of those fish are very diverse. They go from here to dry tortugas throughout the Florida Keys, and they live different parts of their life in different places.
Getting a handle on what kinds of natural treasures our South Florida parks hold is extremely important to efforts to restore water flow in the Everglades. Over the next 30 years, the state and federal governments will be trying to put pieces of the Everglades back together. Their efforts will affect every place downstream, from Everglades marshes to Biscayne's coral reefs.
It's going to change. It's going to alter the bay. It's going to alter the fish that we find in the bay. It's going to alter various plants. It's going to alter various animals that we find in that environment. So we need to be able to show people what it's going to look like in the future, and we also need to be able to use that as a barometer of how far we've been successful with it, being able to push back the clock in making a more natural system within Biscayne Bay. And I think that these inventories are going to be very important in helping us to see benchmarks of when we're successful.
Knowing what exists today will help managers decide where to put their efforts, what to protect, and what needs more attention.
As a manager, without understanding what is there in your park, you have a hard time knowing what you want to do with it. You can't set direction unless you have an understanding of where the various resources are in the park now.
This is a really exciting time for the National Park Service because for the first time that I can think of, they're really taking a very proactive approach to finding out what naturally occurs in each of these parks. And in conjunction with that, they're trying to figure out what the natural balance of that ecosystem is supposed to be. So we're doing inventories to see what's there. We're doing exotic plant and animal treatments to remove the things we know didn't belong there in the first place. And we're doing restoration to try to bring these things back to where they're supposed to be. The national parks are supposed to be set up so that we can provide for future generations a non-impaired ecosystem. And so to understand that ecosystem better through inventory work, through monitoring, and through restoration, the Park Service is going to have a better idea from this data on how we need to craft these places.
The inventory and monitoring program is essential for the conservation of the lands and waters that lie within our national parks. It is a tool managers will use to make sure our parks and the animals and plants that inhabit them exist for years to come.